Morning rain slid down the glass towers of downtown Chicago, while traffic groaned beneath the gray sky. Roosevelt High School stood between crowded streets and old brick apartment buildings like a fortress trying too hard to look expensive. Yellow buses lined the curb as students poured through the front gates wearing designer sneakers, varsity jackets, and polished smiles. 17-year-old Ethan Brooks walked among them unnoticed. His hoodie was faded at the sleeves, his backpack zipper barely worked, and his shoes carried the white scars of too many winters. He kept his eyes low as he crossed the crowded hallway because experience had taught him something simple. Attention usually led to humiliation. Near the trophy case, laughter suddenly erupted. "Yo, look who escaped the homeless shelter," Tyler Dawson shouted. Several students turned immediately. Tyler leaned against the lockers with two basketball teammates beside him, grinning like he had just delivered the funniest joke in the world. Ethan kept walking. Behind Tyler, Brielle Sanders lifted her phone slightly, secretly recording. "Wait," she mocked loudly. "Maybe he's rehearsing for another sad piano funeral." More laughter exploded through the hallway. Ethan's chest tightened, but his face remained blank. He had learned long ago that reacting only entertained people more. As he passed the principal's office, the doors opened sharply. Principal Raymond Keller stepped out in an expensive charcoal suit, carrying coffee while speaking to two wealthy parents touring the school. Then his eyes landed on Ethan. The principal's expression shifted instantly with irritation. "Mr. Brooks," Keller called loudly enough for nearby students to hear. Did the dress code suddenly stop applying to certain people? The hallway grew quiet. Ethan stopped slowly. "My apologies, sir," he said softly. Keller glanced down at Ethan's worn shoes with visible disgust. "You represent this school every time you walk these halls," he said coldly. "At least attempt to look respectable." Tyler smirked behind him. The wealthy parents exchanged uncomfortable glances while Ethan nodded silently and walked away without another word. By lunchtime, the rain had become heavier. Inside the cafeteria, students crowded around tables buzzing with gossip and social media drama. Ethan sat alone near the vending machines, sketching musical notes inside an old notebook while eating chips from a dollar store packet. Across the room, Lily Carter noticed him again. She sat with art club students near the windows, quietly watching as Tyler passed Ethan's table and intentionally knocked the chips onto the floor. Nobody helped. Ethan bent calmly to clean the mess himself while laughter echoed nearby. Lily looked away, guilt twisting inside her stomach. That evening, long after the final school bell faded into the city noise, Marcus Brooks pushed a janitor cart through Roosevelt's empty corridors. His back ached from exhaustion. He paused outside the science wing to cough into a handkerchief before continuing to mop the floors beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Downstairs, Ethan waited quietly near the auditorium while his father finished working. The school felt different at night. Softer. Honest. No crowds. No laughter. Only silence. Ethan slipped inside the dark music room and sat before the dusty grand piano near the stage. For several seconds, he stared at the keys without moving. Then his fingers touched the piano gently. The first note floated through the empty auditorium like a memory refusing to die. Outside in the hallway, Elena Ramirez stopped walking. The music pulled her toward the door immediately. Inside the shadows, Ethan played alone, unaware that for the first time in years, someone was truly listening. The final piano note lingered inside the empty auditorium long after Ethan's fingers stopped moving. From the hallway doorway, Elena Ramirez remained frozen. For nearly 20 years, she had taught music at Roosevelt High. She had listened to hundreds of talented students perform complicated classical pieces with technical perfection. But this was different. What she had just heard carried pain. Real pain. Ethan looked up suddenly after noticing movement near the doorway. His entire body stiffened when he saw her standing there. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, standing from the bench. "I wasn't supposed to be in here." Mrs. Ramirez stepped slowly into the room, her heels echoing softly across the wooden floor. "Who taught you to play like that?" she asked quietly. Ethan avoided her eyes. "No one." She almost smiled in disbelief. "No one plays like that without training." Ethan shrugged uncomfortably. "My mom used to love music," he admitted softly. "After she died, I just kept teaching myself." Rain tapped gently against the high auditorium windows while silence settled between them. Mrs. Ramirez walked toward the piano carefully. What was that piece called? Ethan hesitated. It doesn't have a name. It should, she replied. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt strangely exposed standing there beside the piano. The music room had always been the only place where nobody judged him. Until now. The next morning, Roosevelt High buzzed with excitement after Principal Keller announced an upcoming city fundraiser attended by wealthy donors, politicians, and education sponsors. Inside the gymnasium, banners were being hung, while student volunteers rushed around preparing decorations. Principal Keller stood at center court, holding a microphone. This event represents Roosevelt High's image, he announced sharply. Only students who reflect excellence and professionalism will participate. Ethan sat high in the bleachers beside the exit doors, barely listening. Then Keller continued, I will not tolerate embarrassment from students who fail to meet expectations. His eyes briefly moved toward Ethan. The message was clear. After assembly, Mrs. Ramirez caught up with Ethan near the stairwell. You should audition for the fundraiser performance, she said immediately. Ethan nearly laughed. No. You belong on stage. No, I don't. She lowered her voice. You have real talent, Ethan. The word talent made him uncomfortable. People like Tyler Dawson had spent years convincing him he possessed nothing worth noticing. Before Ethan could respond, loud footsteps echoed down the hallway. Tyler appeared beside Brielle and two basketball teammates. Well, look at this, Tyler mocked. The ghost kid joined choir now. Brielle smirked while chewing gum. Maybe he'll play sad music while everyone cries for him. Mrs. Ramirez's expression hardened instantly. That's enough. Tyler raised his hands innocently, but his grin remained. As they walked away laughing, Ethan stared down at the floor again. You see, he muttered quietly. This is why I stay invisible. Later that afternoon, Marcus Brooks worked overtime cleaning the upper classrooms while listening to an old voicemail from debt collectors he could no longer afford to answer. At the same time across downtown Chicago, luxury cars pulled outside Roosevelt High as city officials toured the school before the fundraiser. Principal Keller smiled proudly beside wealthy investors while teachers forced nervous politeness. Then disaster struck. A freshman accidentally spilled punch near the entrance lobby. Keller exploded immediately. Can nobody in this school follow simple instructions? He snapped loudly. The frightened freshman looked close to tears. Nearby, Ethan watched silently while carrying his backpack toward the exit. For a brief moment, he remembered his mother's voice from years ago. Music speaks loudest for people who are afraid to. That night, Ethan returned to the auditorium alone again. Only this time, Mrs. Ramirez had left something waiting beside the piano. A blank sheet of music paper. And written across the top were 4 words. Your story belongs here. Cold wind swept through downtown Chicago as Ethan Brooks stood outside Roosevelt High waiting for the crossing light to change. Around him, students laughed loudly about weekend parties and basketball games while traffic lights reflected off the wet streets. Ethan remained alone near the curb, his headphones hanging loosely around his neck, the folded blank music sheet Mrs. Ramirez gave him still hidden inside his backpack. For the first time in years, he had actually tried writing something the night before. Not homework, not notes, music. But now doubt followed him again like a shadow. Inside Roosevelt High, the atmosphere buzzed with preparation for the upcoming city fundraiser. Expensive flower arrangements arrived in the lobby while student volunteers practiced speeches and dance performances. Principal Raymond Keller moved through the hallways like a politician preparing for television cameras, constantly criticizing decorations and barking instructions at teachers. Near the art room, Lily Carter sat quietly sketching charcoal portraits for the school mural project when Ethan passed by the open doorway. She noticed the exhaustion in his face immediately. Hey, she called softly. Ethan stopped awkwardly. Lily hesitated before offering a small smile. You dropped this yesterday. She held out a folded paper. Ethan recognized it instantly. His unfinished music notes. Embarrassment rushed through him as he grabbed it quickly. Thanks. You wrote that? She asked carefully. Ethan nodded once, clearly uncomfortable. Lily looked genuinely surprised. It's beautiful. Nobody had ever used that word to describe anything connected to him before. Ethan didn't know how to respond. Before the moment could continue, loud laughter echoed down the hallway. Tyler Dawson approached with Brielle and 2 teammates carrying basketball gear over their shoulders. Well, look at Roosevelt's saddest love story, Tyler mocked. Brielle grinned immediately. Careful, Lily. He'll probably write depressing piano songs about you now. The boys burst into laughter. Lily's face reddened with anger, but Ethan quietly stepped away before things escalated further. As he disappeared down the hallway, Lily stared after him with growing frustration. For some reason, seeing him constantly humiliated bothered her more each day. That evening, Marcus Brooks pushed his janitor cart through Roosevelt's science wing while thunder rumbled outside the city skyline. He paused briefly beside the trophy case, staring at photographs of successful former students smiling beneath championship banners. Lawyers, athletes, entrepreneurs, people Roosevelt proudly celebrated. Marcus quietly wondered whether anyone would ever look at his son that way. Upstairs in the auditorium, Ethan sat alone at the piano again. The darkness outside wrapped around the massive room, while soft golden stage lights reflected across the polished black keys. Slowly, Ethan began playing the melody he started writing the night before. The music carried memories of hospital rooms, sleepless nights, empty apartment dinners, and the silence left behind after his mother died. Every note felt personal. Every note hurt. Unknown to Ethan, someone had entered the back row quietly. An older man wearing a dark overcoat sat hidden in the shadows near the rear aisle, listening without moving. His name was Lionel Graves. Once one of America's most respected jazz producers, Lionel had disappeared from public life years earlier after personal tragedy destroyed his career and marriage. He rarely attended public events anymore. But tonight, the sound of Ethan's piano stopped him completely. Lionel leaned forward slowly, stunned by the raw emotion pouring from the stage. This wasn't ordinary student talent. This was truth. When the song finally ended, Ethan lowered his head silently over the piano keys, unaware that somewhere in the darkness, a stranger's life had just changed alongside his own. The following morning, downtown Chicago woke beneath pale winter sunlight, reflecting off frozen sidewalks and crowded intersections. Roosevelt High buzzed louder than usual after rumors spread that wealthy donors and city officials would attend the upcoming fundraiser. Everywhere Ethan Brooks walked, students discussed performances, outfits, and social media opportunities. Meanwhile, Ethan carried something far heavier than school gossip. The memory of the stranger sitting in the dark auditorium refused to leave his mind. Inside the music classroom, Elena Ramirez organized sheet music while nervously glancing toward the hallway every few seconds. The moment Ethan entered, she shut the classroom door behind him. "You need to sit down," she said immediately. Ethan frowned slightly. Mrs. Ramirez looked unusually tense. "That man who heard you play last night," she continued carefully. "His name is Lionel Graves." Ethan's expression remained blank at first. Then recognition slowly appeared. Even Ethan knew the name. Lionel Graves was legendary. Music documentaries still talked about him like a ghost from another era. The producer who discovered Grammy-winning artists before suddenly disappearing from public life years ago. "He wants to meet you," Mrs. Ramirez said softly. Ethan almost laughed from disbelief. "Why?" "Because he thinks you're extraordinary." The word hit Ethan uncomfortably again. Before he could answer, the classroom door opened sharply. Principal Raymond Keller stepped inside, wearing his usual cold expression. "I hope class preparations for the fundraiser are progressing properly," he announced while scanning the room. Then his eyes landed on Ethan. His face tightened immediately. "Mr. Brooks," Keller said flatly, "why are you here during lunch hours?" Mrs. Ramirez answered before Ethan could speak. "We were discussing music opportunities." Keller folded his arms. Music opportunities for him? The silence that followed felt humiliating. Ethan stared toward the floor. Keller sighed impatiently. "Roosevelt represents excellence. The fundraiser isn't an open mic night for hobbyists." Mrs. Ramirez's voice sharpened slightly. "Ethan is talented. Talent requires discipline, presentation, and image," Keller replied coldly. "Not just emotion." Then he looked directly at Ethan. "Students should focus on realistic futures based on their circumstances." The words landed exactly the way Keller intended. Mrs. Ramirez looked furious, but Ethan quietly grabbed his backpack first. "I should go," he muttered. As Ethan walked into the hallway, anger burned quietly inside him for the first time in years. Keller never insulted him directly enough to get in trouble, but every word carried the same message. "People like you do not belong here." That afternoon, Roosevelt's basketball gym exploded with cheers during practice, while Ethan crossed the parking lot alone beneath gray clouds. Tyler Dawson noticed him immediately from the court entrance. "Yo, Mozart!" Tyler shouted loudly. Several players laughed. Tyler jogged closer with Brielle beside him. "We heard the school janitor's son thinks he's famous now," Brielle mocked while scrolling through her phone. Tyler smirked. "You planning to perform sad songs for spare change downtown?" Ethan kept walking, but Tyler stepped directly into his path. "You know what your problem is?" Tyler asked quietly. "You actually think being different makes you special." For a moment, Ethan nearly answered back. Then he saw Marcus across the parking lot unloading cleaning supplies from his old truck. His father looked exhausted already. Ethan swallowed his anger and walked away silently. Later that evening, Mrs. Ramirez drove Ethan across downtown Chicago to meet Lionel Graves inside a small underground jazz club hidden beneath an old brick building near the riverfront. The club was nearly empty except for soft trumpet music floating through dim golden lights. Lionel sat alone in a corner booth. When Ethan approached nervously, the older man studied him carefully before speaking. "You play like someone carrying ghosts," Lionel said quietly. Ethan didn't know how to respond. Lionel slid a brochure across the table. "The Chicago Young Musicians Showcase. One of the most prestigious youth music competitions in the country. I want you to audition," Lionel said. Ethan stared at the brochure in shock. "That competition is for elite music schools," he whispered. Lionel leaned back calmly. "No," he replied. "It's for people brave enough to be heard." For the first time in years, Ethan felt something dangerous beginning to grow inside him. Hope. Snow drifted across downtown Chicago as Ethan Brooks sat silently beside the train window on his way home from school. Outside, the city blurred past in streaks of gray buildings, traffic lights, and crowded sidewalks. In his backpack rested the Chicago Young Musicians Showcase brochure Lionel Graves had given him 3 days earlier. Ethan had not stopped thinking about it since. At Roosevelt High, whispers followed him everywhere now. Somehow, Tyler Dawson had discovered Ethan was secretly preparing for a music competition. By lunchtime, students were already mocking him openly. "Careful," Tyler announced loudly inside the cafeteria. Roosevelt's Resident Depression soundtrack might become famous. Laughter echoed across the room. Brielle Sanders sat nearby editing another humiliating social media post about Ethan. This time she used a blurry photo of him leaving the music room late at night with the caption, "When the school janitor's kid thinks he's Beethoven." Hundreds of students had already shared it. Ethan kept his eyes down and walked past them carrying his tray, pretending none of it mattered. But it did matter. Every word stayed with him long after the laughter ended. That afternoon, Principal Raymond Keller posted the official fundraiser performance list outside the main office. Students crowded around excitedly searching for their names. Ethan stopped when he saw Tyler listed for a featured sports recognition segment. Brielle's dance team was also included. His name was nowhere. Mrs. Ramirez appeared moments later beside him. "You were removed," she said quietly, anger visible in her eyes. Ethan stared at the paper silently. Keller said the program needed students who represented the school properly. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Then he folded the competition brochure slowly and shoved it deeper into his backpack. "I told you this was pointless," he muttered. Mrs. Ramirez stepped closer. "Do not let small people decide your future." But Ethan no longer looked convinced. That evening, freezing wind swept through Roosevelt High's parking lot, while Marcus Brooks loaded heavy trash bags into the school dumpster behind the gymnasium. His breathing sounded strained as he wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold weather. Inside the building, Ethan waited near the auditorium after finishing practice alone. Then suddenly, shouting erupted outside. Ethan ran toward the back exit and froze. Marcus leaned weakly against the brick wall near the dumpsters while another janitor frantically called for help. "Dad!" Marcus collapsed before Ethan could reach him. The next few hours became a blur of ambulance sirens, hospital lights, and nervous silence. Inside St. Mary's Hospital, doctors explained that Marcus's blood pressure had become dangerously high due to stress, exhaustion, and overwork. "He needs rest immediately," the doctor warned. "If this continues, the consequences could become serious." Later that night, Ethan sat beside his father's hospital bed while snow fell heavily beyond the window. Marcus looked exhausted and pale beneath the dim hospital lights. I'm sorry, he whispered weakly. Ethan frowned. For what? Marcus forced a tired smile. For giving you this kind of life. The words hit Ethan harder than anything Tyler or Keller had ever said. For years, Marcus had worked endless nights cleaning classrooms while pretending everything was fine. And Ethan had never truly realized how much his father was sacrificing just to keep them afloat. You didn't fail me, Ethan said quietly, his voice shaking slightly. Marcus studied him carefully before speaking again. Mrs. Ramirez visited earlier, he said softly. She told me about the competition. Ethan looked away immediately. I'm not doing it anymore. Marcus became silent for a moment. Then he slowly reached for Ethan's hand. Your mother used to say music was the only time you looked fearless, he whispered. Emotion tightened painfully inside Ethan's chest. Marcus smiled weakly. Don't bury the one thing that makes you feel alive just because cruel people are loud. Outside the hospital window, Chicago's skyline glowed beneath falling snow while Ethan sat quietly beside his father, realizing something had finally broken inside him. Not his love for music, his fear. And for the first time, Ethan began wondering what might happen if he stopped hiding from the world entirely. The night of the Chicago Young Musicians Showcase arrived beneath freezing winds and glowing city lights in downtown Chicago. Luxury cars lined the streets outside the historic Belmont Theater, while photographers crowded near the entrance capturing wealthy families, music coaches, and elite students arriving in elegant formal wear. Inside the massive theater, crystal chandeliers reflected soft gold light across rows of velvet seats. The atmosphere felt expensive, polished, and intimidating. Ethan Brooks stood backstage gripping his sheet music with trembling fingers. Everything around him felt unreal. Professional pianists warmed up quietly nearby while contestants from prestigious academies adjusted designer suits and expensive instruments. Ethan suddenly became painfully aware of his simple black jacket borrowed from a thrift store and shoes polished carefully by Marcus earlier that evening. Across the backstage hallway, Lionel Graves noticed Ethan's growing anxiety immediately. You're thinking too much, Lionel said calmly while straightening Ethan's collar slightly. I don't belong here, Ethan admitted quietly. Lionel studied him carefully. Every person in this building came here to impress people, he replied. You came here to tell the truth. That's why you matter. Meanwhile, several Roosevelt High students entered the theater laughing loudly near the back rows. Tyler Dawson led the group confidently, while Brielle recorded social media videos for her followers. This is going to be painful to watch, Tyler joked. Even Principal Raymond Keller had arrived, mostly because city officials and wealthy donors attended the event. He sat near the center aisle with a forced public smile, already preparing excuses in case Ethan embarrassed Roosevelt High publicly. Backstage, Ethan took a deep breath and searched for his performance sheets again. Then his stomach dropped. The pages were ruined. Dark stains spread across the music while entire sections had been ripped apart violently. For one horrifying moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. No, he whispered. Panic flooded through him as he stared at the destroyed pages. Across the hallway, Tyler smirked while pretending to scroll through his phone. Ethan understood immediately. Mrs. Ramirez rushed over in alarm. What happened? Ethan's hands shook uncontrollably. I can't do this, he muttered. I can't remember everything. The stage manager suddenly called his name. 30 seconds until performance. The theater audience applauded politely as the previous contestant exited the stage. Ethan stood frozen backstage while fear closed around his chest like a trap. Then Lionel stepped beside him quietly. Look at me, the old producer said firmly. Ethan forced himself to raise his eyes. Lionel pointed toward the destroyed music sheets lying on the floor. Real music was never inside those pages, he said softly. It's inside you. The words hit Ethan deeply. For years he had hidden behind silence because silence felt safe. But tonight there was nowhere left to hide. The announcer called his name again. Ethan walked onto the stage. The massive theater lights nearly blinded him at first. Hundreds of faces stared toward him from the darkness beyond the piano. Somewhere in the audience sat Marcus, recently discharged from the hospital against doctor recommendations because he refused to miss this night. Ethan sat before the grand piano slowly. Then he closed his eyes. For one terrifying second, the theater became completely silent. And then his fingers moved. The first note drifted through the auditorium softly, fragile as memory. Everything else disappeared. The bullying, the loneliness, the humiliation, the hospital rooms, his mother's death, his father's sacrifices. Every emotion poured directly into the music. The melody grew larger, deeper, more painful and beautiful with every passing moment. People in the audience slowly stopped whispering. Several judges leaned forward in stunned silence. Near the back row, Lily Carter wiped tears from her eyes quietly. Even Principal Keller sat frozen. The final section exploded with raw emotional force before fading into one soft, trembling note that lingered through the theater like heartbreak refusing to die. Silence followed. Complete silence. Then suddenly, the entire theater rose to its feet. The standing ovation thundered across the auditorium like an earthquake. People applauded wildly while some openly cried. Backstage cameras recorded everything. And somewhere near the rear balcony, Noah Bennett uploaded a short clip online with a simple caption. "The quiet kid everyone mocked just shocked Chicago." Within hours, the video began spreading across the internet faster than anyone imagined. By sunrise, downtown Chicago was already buzzing with Ethan Brooks's performance. Television screens inside coffee shops replayed clips from the Chicago Young Musicians Showcase, while radio hosts discussed the unknown Roosevelt High student who stunned the city overnight. Social media exploded with reactions as millions of viewers shared Noah Bennett's video across platforms faster than anyone expected. Inside a crowded subway train heading toward Roosevelt High, Ethan sat silently beside Marcus while strangers unknowingly watched his performance on their phones only feet away. Neither of them spoke much. Marcus looked emotional every time another passenger praised the mysterious piano player online. Ethan only stared out the window, overwhelmed by how quickly his life had changed in less than 12 hours. The moment they arrived at Roosevelt High, chaos surrounded the building. News vans lined the street outside campus, while reporters crowded near the entrance gates interviewing students. Camera flashes lit the sidewalks as parents and teachers whispered excitedly. "Is Ethan Brooks here yet? Did Roosevelt really ignore him for years? Who's the principal?" The questions echoed everywhere. Inside the school lobby, Tyler Dawson froze when several students suddenly confronted him angrily. "You destroyed his music sheets?" One student demanded after backstage footage leaked online, showing Tyler near Ethan's performance area moments before the sabotage. Tyler tried laughing it off at first, but another student held up a phone showing security footage already spreading online. The hallway atmosphere shifted instantly. For the first time in years, Tyler no longer looked untouchable. Nearby, Brielle Sanders stared in horror at her own social media pages collapsing. Thousands of comments flooded her accounts accusing her of bullying Ethan publicly for months. Brand sponsors began removing partnerships almost immediately. Meanwhile, Principal Raymond Keller marched furiously through the main office while administrators scrambled around him nervously. "This school will not become some internet circus," Keller snapped. But the situation was already spiraling beyond his control. Noah Bennett sat inside the journalism classroom uploading a new article onto the student newspaper website. Over the past few hours, former students had begun messaging him privately with stories about Keller humiliating scholarship students, ignoring bullying complaints, and favoring wealthy families for years. Noah realized Ethan's story was only part of something much bigger. At lunchtime, Ethan tried avoiding attention by slipping into the music room quietly. But Mrs. Ramirez followed moments later carrying her laptop with wide eyes. "You need to see this," she whispered. She opened a video interview from a major Chicago news station. Lionel Graves appeared on screen. "I've spent decades around musicians," Lionel told reporters. "What Ethan Brooks possesses cannot be taught. But what shocks me most is that his own school nearly buried that talent completely." The interview spread even faster than Ethan's performance itself. Across the city, people began criticizing Roosevelt High publicly. Inside his office, Keller watched the broadcast with growing panic. Then his secretary entered nervously. "The school board wants an emergency meeting tomorrow morning." For the first time, genuine fear crossed Keller's face. That afternoon, Ethan finally walked into the cafeteria again. But this time, the room reacted differently. Students who once mocked him now stared silently. Some looked ashamed. Others whispered nervously while moving out of his path. Lily Carter approached, carefully carrying 2 juice bottles. "You okay?" she asked softly. Ethan almost answered automatically with "fine." but the word no longer felt honest. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. Lily smiled slightly. "Well, the entire city knows your name now." Before Ethan could respond, reporters suddenly appeared near the cafeteria entrance asking students questions. Cameras immediately turned toward him. The room fell silent again. One reporter stepped closer. "Ethan," she asked carefully, "how does it feel knowing your school overlooked your talent for years?" For a brief moment, Ethan thought about every insult, every hallway humiliation, every time Principal Keller made him feel invisible. Then he answered calmly, "Some people only notice value after the world tells them it exists." The cafeteria became completely silent. And somewhere upstairs inside his office, Principal Keller heard those words replaying through every television screen in the building. A bitter wind swept through downtown Chicago as reporters crowded outside Roosevelt High before sunrise. Satellite vans blocked half the street, while camera crews adjusted equipment beneath glowing streetlights. Overnight, the story had grown far beyond Ethan Brooks's viral performance. Now the entire city wanted answers. Inside the school building, tension filled every hallway like smoke. Teachers whispered nervously near classroom doors while students refreshed social media feeds every few seconds. Rumors spread faster than announcements. Principal Raymond Keller arrived through the side entrance hoping to avoid reporters, but cameras immediately swarmed him anyway. "Principal Keller, is it true you removed Ethan Brooks from school performances? Did Roosevelt High ignore bullying complaints? Are you under investigation?" Keller forced a tight smile, while security guards pushed reporters backward. "No comment at this time," he snapped before disappearing inside. But the confidence he once carried so effortlessly was beginning to crack. Upstairs, the emergency school board meeting had already begun. Inside the conference room, district officials sat around a polished oak table reviewing printed articles, interview clips, and student complaints stacked in thick folders. Several board members looked disturbed as Noah Bennett presented evidence gathered from current and former students. "There's a pattern," Noah explained carefully. Scholarship students and low-income students were repeatedly excluded from opportunities, while wealthy families received special treatment. Mrs. Ramirez sat nearby holding copies of fundraiser documents showing Ethan's removal from performances despite her recommendations. Meanwhile, outside the office windows, students gathered in the courtyard carrying handmade signs supporting Ethan. Some signs read, "Talent has no status," and "Roosevelt failed its own student." For the first time in years, Roosevelt High no longer felt controlled by fear. Downstairs near the gymnasium, Tyler Dawson cleaned out his locker while avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. Students whispered openly whenever he walked past. The leaked sabotage footage had destroyed his popularity overnight. Even Brielle refused to stand beside him publicly anymore after backlash ruined her online reputation. "You really messed up," one teammate muttered before walking away. Tyler slammed his locker shut angrily, but beneath the anger sat something unfamiliar. Shame. At the same time across town, Ethan and Marcus sat inside a small diner near the riverfront while television screens replayed debates about Roosevelt High's administration. Marcus stirred his coffee quietly. "You know," he said softly, "your mother used to say truth eventually gets tired of hiding." Ethan stared out the window at passing traffic. None of this felt real yet. Fame, interviews, headlines, it all seemed distant compared to the years of silence that came before it. Then Ethan's phone buzzed repeatedly. Scholarship emails, music academy invitations, interview requests. One message stood out most. A full scholarship offer from a prestigious summer music conservatory in Boston. Marcus looked emotional reading it. "You did this," he whispered proudly. But back at Roosevelt High, Principal Keller's situation was collapsing rapidly. During the final stage of the board meeting, additional testimonies emerged from cafeteria workers, janitors, and former teachers describing years of humiliating behavior towards struggling students and lower staff members. One retired teacher even revealed Keller once rejected scholarship recommendations simply because certain students did not fit Roosevelt's image. The room fell silent after that statement. Hours later, Keller was called back into the conference room. The board chairman looked grim. "Effective immediately," he announced. "You are suspended pending full investigation." Keller's face drained of color. "This is political pressure," he argued sharply. "I built Roosevelt's reputation." "No. Another board member replied coldly. Students built this school. You just decided which ones mattered. Outside the building, reporters exploded into motion the moment news of Keller's suspension leaked. Cheers erupted from students gathered near the courtyard. Inside the music room upstairs, Ethan heard the noise through the windows while sitting quietly at the piano. For years, Keller's voice had controlled Roosevelt High like law. Now that voice was finally powerless. Mrs. Ramirez entered moments later smiling through tears. He's gone, she whispered. Ethan looked down at the piano keys silently. Surprisingly, he felt no victory, only relief. And somewhere deep inside, he realized the invisible boy everyone once ignored had just changed an entire school without ever raising his voice. Snow melted slowly along the sidewalks of downtown Chicago as Roosevelt High prepared for something nobody could have imagined only weeks earlier, an assembly honoring Ethan Brooks. The same school that once treated him like a shadow now covered its entrance banners with his name. Students filled the hallways early that morning, buzzing with excitement, while teachers hurried toward the auditorium carrying flowers, microphones, and camera equipment. Local news stations had already announced they would broadcast portions of the event live. Inside the Brooks apartment across the city, Marcus adjusted the collar of his only suit jacket while staring nervously into the bathroom mirror. The jacket was old and slightly too large, but Ethan had secretly paid for dry cleaning using money from his first online music royalties after the viral performance exploded nationwide. Marcus still struggled to believe any of this was real. You look fine, Ethan said quietly from the doorway. Marcus smiled weakly. I've cleaned that auditorium for 10 years, he admitted. Feels strange walking in through the front entrance. The word stayed with Ethan during the entire drive to Roosevelt High. Outside the school, reporters and students crowded the sidewalks again. But this time the atmosphere felt different. Warm. Respectful. As Ethan stepped from the car beside Marcus, applause unexpectedly broke out from students gathered near the entrance. Marcus froze completely. Some students even moved aside to clear a path for him. For years, most of them barely noticed the quiet janitor pushing cleaning carts through empty hallways at night. Now they looked at him differently. Inside the packed auditorium, golden stage lights glowed across rows of students, teachers, parents, and city officials. Cameras pointed toward the stage where a grand piano stood beneath a massive Roosevelt High banner. Mrs. Ramirez waited near the curtains, smiling proudly, while Noah Bennett prepared notes beside the media crew. Even Lily Carter looked emotional sitting near the front row. As the assembly began, the interim principal welcomed Ethan formally before introducing his recent scholarship offers, national media attention, and recognition from major music institutions. Thunderous applause filled the auditorium. Then Ethan walked onto the stage. The crowd rose instantly to their feet. For a moment, Ethan stood silently beneath the bright lights, staring across the same auditorium where he once practiced alone in darkness while everyone ignored him. Now every eye in the building watched him carefully. He stepped toward the microphone slowly. I used to think invisible people stayed invisible forever, he began quietly. The room fell completely silent. Ethan spoke about loneliness, bullying, and fear without bitterness in his voice. He spoke about losing his mother young and spending years believing he had nothing valuable to offer the world. Several students lowered their heads in shame while listening. Then Ethan paused briefly. But none of this happened because I was strong alone, he continued softly. He turned toward the audience. Dad, can you come up here? Confused murmurs spread through the auditorium as Marcus froze near the middle row. Students began clapping encouragingly while Marcus slowly stood. His hands shook visibly as he walked toward the stage. The moment Marcus stepped under the lights, Ethan saw something painful in his father's face. Nervousness. The same nervousness people carry when they spend years feeling unseen. Ethan wrapped his arms around him tightly. This man, Ethan said emotionally into the microphone, cleaned classrooms every night so I could keep dreaming during the day. Silence swept through the auditorium instantly. Marcus lowered his eyes as tears filled them unexpectedly. Ethan continued speaking. When everyone else saw a janitor, I saw the hardest working person I've ever known. Several teachers openly wiped tears away. Then something remarkable happened. One student stood up clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium rose to its feet in a roaring standing ovation directed not at Ethan, but at Marcus Brooks. The applause thundered through the building like a wave. Marcus looked completely overwhelmed as tears finally rolled down his face openly. Near the back row, even Tyler Dawson sat silently staring at the stage with regret written across his expression. And somewhere deep inside Roosevelt High, the invisible people were finally being seen. Spring arrived slowly over Chicago, washing the city in pale sunlight and thawing streets that had spent months buried beneath snow. Roosevelt High no longer felt like the same school Ethan Brooks once feared walking through every morning. The hallways were quieter now. Kinder. Posters promoting mental health awareness and anti-bullying campaigns covered the walls where sports banners once dominated everything. For the first time in years, students who had always been ignored were finally being noticed. Inside the newly renovated music room, Mrs. Ramirez watched proudly as younger students practiced piano and violin together after school. The administration had officially approved a new arts scholarship program, funded partly by donations that poured in after Ethan's story captured national attention. Noah Bennett now worked remotely with a major Chicago newspaper while finishing his final semester at Roosevelt. His investigation into discrimination inside the school district had earned statewide recognition. Lily Carter's artwork had also gone viral online after she created a charcoal portrait titled The Invisible Boy, inspired by Ethan sitting alone beside the auditorium piano months earlier. The piece was eventually displayed inside a downtown Chicago gallery. As for Tyler Dawson, the former basketball star moved through school almost unnoticed now. His suspension for sabotaging Ethan's performance remained permanently attached to his academic record. Most students no longer admired him the way they once had. Some mistakes changed people forever. On Ethan's final afternoon before leaving Chicago, he walked slowly through Roosevelt High alone while classes continued quietly behind closed doors. Sunlight poured through the hallway windows, casting long reflections across the polished floors Marcus once cleaned every night. Ethan stopped outside Principal Keller's old office. The nameplate had already been removed. A new interim principal now occupied the space, someone focused less on image and more on students. For several seconds, Ethan simply stared at the empty wall where Keller's authority once terrified everyone inside the building. Then he kept walking. Downstairs near the auditorium entrance, Marcus waited holding 2 train tickets in his weathered hands. "You ready?" he asked softly. Ethan looked around the hallway one last time. It felt strange leaving behind the place where so much pain began, and where everything finally changed. That evening, downtown Chicago glowed beneath orange sunset skies as crowds gathered outside Union Station. Ethan had officially accepted the full scholarship offer from the prestigious Juilliard School Summer Conservatory program. News reporters still occasionally followed his story, calling him the silent pianist who exposed an entire school system. But Ethan no longer cared about headlines. What mattered sat beside him carrying an old duffel bag and smiling proudly despite tired eyes. "Marcus." Before boarding the train, Ethan noticed someone approaching through the crowd. Principal Raymond Keller. The former principal looked older somehow, diminished beneath the city lights. His suspension had become permanent after further investigations uncovered years of misconduct and discrimination complaints. Keller stopped a few feet away awkwardly. "I heard you were leaving tonight," he said quietly. Marcus stiffened beside Ethan immediately. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Keller lowered his eyes. "I was wrong about you," he admitted painfully. "About a lot of things." Ethan studied him carefully. Months earlier, he would have dreamed about hearing those words. Now they simply sounded sad. "You taught students to judge people before knowing them," Ethan replied calmly. "That damage lasts longer than you think." Keller nodded slowly, unable to argue. The station announcement echoed overhead, calling final boarding. Marcus gently touched Ethan's shoulder. As Ethan stepped toward the train doors, he paused briefly and looked back at Roosevelt High's former principal one final time. "I hope the next invisible kid gets treated differently," he said softly. Then he boarded the train. Hours later, Chicago's skyline faded into darkness outside the moving windows while Marcus slept quietly beside him. Ethan placed his headphones on and stared out at the endless night ahead. Somewhere far behind them stood a school that once tried to silence him. But now the world was finally listening.